Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It is great to be with you. And, I'm here as usual with David Kinnaman. David, can you believe when we're in like year 3 of this, whatever this is? It's nuts.
Yeah, no doubt. What a crazy time to be a leader. And it's been our privilege through these last, we're coming up now close to 2 years on this podcast, as we turn the calendar and we think about what's next and, in 2022. And, such an amazing and difficult time to be a leader. And, I think it's, I'm encouraged by what I see, but also, sobered by the realities of trying to lead the church in these changing times.
Right. And we're recording this a little bit in advance, but I'm pretty guaranteed that by the time this airs, there'll be some kind of curveball we fully didn't see coming. And that's why I'm so glad in a few minutes we'll have our guest, Glenn Packiam, join us. But we want to talk about pastoral burnout. And David, as usual, you bring some data to this. And we had a really big stat that we're going to drill down on, that we've sort of taken the pulse twice over the last year to see how pastors are doing. And the news is challenging.
Yeah, so at the end of 2021, this idea of how pastors are doing, really, the stats were staggering. 38% of pastors in October of 2021 said they'd been giving real serious consideration to quitting being in full-time ministry within the last year. And if regular listeners will remember, at the beginning of 2021, that number was at 29%. So there was a huge increase. Now, almost 2 out of 5 pastors say they're seriously considering quitting. And I was talking to my dad recently about this, who is a longtime pastor of a big church in Phoenix, Arizona. He's semi-retired now, but we were talking about this particular stat. And he said, David, I want to quit almost every week when I was in ministry. It's just that now the pastors that I know, there's so much more pressure on them, given the political environment and social media and the challenges of the pandemic, and it's just pushing them over the edge. And so again, as listeners, we're here to encourage you in your ministry, that God has a plan for you and a wonderful plan for your life, but also just recognizing you're not alone, you're not crazy, and that there's still an important essential role for local church leaders to be able to sort of work through the sets of challenges that I think are present in the current environment.
So here's a follow-up on that. I was having a conversation with a seasoned leader that I respect, who's in his 60s, and the stat that you just quoted was shared in this group. And he kind of said, isn't that every year in ministry where we all think about, quitting? And I realized that the question was, serious consideration to quitting being in full-time ministry, which is different than just, I'd like another church. Just so we can benchmark that, how aberrant is that from historic norms?
Well, we started this question really during the pandemic, and so we don't have a direct apples-to-apples comparison. But the best I could say, or the most clear way of explaining that, is that the fact that it went from 29%, which seemed like a pretty big number, and, to give consideration, real and serious consideration to quitting full-time ministry. We ask about the last year, so there's partly it's just a longer time horizon. We asked the same question both times in January of 2021 and in October of 2021. But I think it's a real sign that there's change happening in the hearts and minds of pastors about things like their own ability to stay engaged in ministry. I think questions around, we've heard more than ever pastors sort of saying, "Is this quite the way we were meant to do it? Is the model working?"
I think that's a fair question.
Yeah, is the model working? And for a long time, many have raised the question and the alarm that we need more lay ministry and not just sort of rely on the ranks of the professionals. And I think there's some good questions around what's happening there. I think we've seen some evidence that people are a big chunk of people, maybe as many as 3 out of 10 practicing Christians, and maybe as many as half of all practicing Christians, but as little as 3 out of 10 practicing Christians have sort of dropped out of church during the pandemic. people moving towards house churches and other expressions. I just lots and lots of moving parts. And so I don't think that we have the ability to say what it would have been exactly prior to the pandemic, because we don't have a tracking question. But clearly from lots and lots of sources, we're seeing that there's an increasing crisis of pastors wanting to stay in the game, and I think that's an important thing for us to be paying attention to.
Which leads us into the second stat on loneliness. We're a lonely bunch, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, we've just released a book called The Loneliness Epidemic with Susan Metis, a Barna fellow. And so there's loneliness across the whole society. And in many ways, pastors are not immune to that. And in 2020, 3 in 5 pastors say they feel either lonely frequently or sometimes that year. And so again, I think loneliness is another part of, again, just the human condition. It turns out, as we look at social research over the last decade or so, loneliness has actually increased, which is a remarkable finding that, despite social media and all the ways we can stay connected, we're not necessarily more social as a result of social media. And pastors, again, are not immune to that. And I think the pandemic, if anything else, it almost leveled the playing field for all kinds of leaders, because all the tools that you would have ordinarily gone to don't seem to work. I mean, I've talked to leader after leader in various industries, and many pastors who said, all the things, the playbooks that we would have ordinarily turned to win the game, to turn the tide, to make a difference, to turn a profit. It's like, man, none of them seem to work. And I think in loneliness, we encounter this question of, who we're going to be doing life with, who we're going to be doing, ministry with, how we're going to go about that. And this sense of not having, any confidence that the tools that we might have ordinarily turned to are going to actually work. And I think we're seeing that, that sort of crisis of friendship. And again, just to say one more thing about pre-pandemic, we know for a fact that a lot of pastors do not have the stability of personal relationships. Not all, but many pastors do not have friendships outside of church ministry with either their colleagues at the current church where they're working, or people who go to church with them, which, you can be friends with people at your church. It's just that there's always this confliction. And so because people need certain things from you, they're I was a pastor's son. I kind of understand those dynamics where it's like, my mom talked about this when my dad retired from the church. It's like all of a sudden the people that she thought were her friends weren't her friends anymore. And so, there's always these interesting dynamics of human relationships. And so I think it's, again, totally natural and normal that pastors are dealing with loneliness. I think it's awesome that they're honest with it about that in our surveys. And then that's the first step towards dealing with it, and then finding ways to be even more relationally connected, especially during a time of great isolation and pressure pulling us in a lot of different directions.
I wrote a post a couple months ago on my website just called Why They're Not Actually Your Friends about this scenario. And I was coaching a friend of mine who was like, oh, this person left and this person stopped giving and this person walked away over X. And finally, trying to help him, I just said, look, they're not actually your friends. And it was something that became clear to me after I was no longer the lead pastor, that I went from thousands of relationships to a handful of relationships that were really committed to and continuing. And some of that was a little bit of a shock, but talking to other people who had stepped out of day-to-day ministry, you realize a lot of that is actually transactional. And it's very confusing when you're leading a church, because you think, oh, well, I hang out with this person all the time. And then you kind of realize, oh yeah, but I said the wrong thing and they left, or I didn't say the right thing and they left, or, they were just there because I was the pastor. Now, the good news is we got a few friends where we ask the question, are we actually friends, or are they just hanging out because I hold a position of power? And the good news is we have some really good friendships that came out of our church, but it's inherently confusing at the time. And the emotional reaction in the comments that post got was off the chain. It was crazy. It was very clarifying for a lot and very affirming.
Yeah. And that's
anything else, David?
Well, that's the last stat I was going to mention was just 1 in 5 pastors rated their satisfaction with friendships as excellent. And so again, I think that's, and 12% rated as below average or poor. So 1 in every 8 pastors say it's poor. Many are saying it's average. But I think as leaders, and this is something I'm personally thinking about a lot, you end up becoming the people you're around, and you just emulate them, and in a lot of different ways, I've been thinking about my own leadership and looking back at classic books I've read on leadership and spiritual leadership. And, we can't just conjure up what God wants to do in us. We need to spend time with the Lord. We need to spend time with people who spend time with the Lord. We need to spend time with people who are who are thinking in healthy ways about life and how to live it, and the brevity of life and what Scripture teaches us about our place as children of God, and the deepest truths of Scripture that tell us about our identity. And anyway, I've been just personally challenged on that level in a lot of different ways. And even then on the basis of friendships, like who are our deep friends? And as you said, they can be people at the local church, at the places where we're ministering. But it's also important for us to make sure we're really intentional about putting people around us who don't have anything to gain from us, who we can't have any pretenses with, and who also are it's important to have non-believing friends, but it's also important for us to have people around us who are encouraging us in this deep walk with the Lord, as we ourselves try to exercise that kind of priestly role in the lives of others, and we just can't do it alone.
It's really well said. Well, I'm excited to have Glenn Packiam with us. Glenn is an associate senior pastor at New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is the lead pastor of New Life Downtown, one of the 7 congregations of New Life Church, and his most recent book, The Resilient Pastor, for the few of you who are watching and many of you who are listening. It's a great book. I just got it in my hands recently. Incorporates Barna data and can be found at bakerpublishinggroup.com. Glenn, welcome back. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Carey. Thank you, David. Great to be here with you guys.
So I'd love to know, you heard David and I share a few stats. Any response to them? Surprise, nuance? What would you add?
Well, it's sad, first of all. And like David said, it's good for pastors to know you're not crazy, you're not alone. And this is a difficult time. The pandemic, in many ways, it's the instigator of some of these waves, some of these news, swells that we're experiencing in culture and oppositions, headwinds. But in other ways, it's just sort of accelerated things that have already been in motion. I mean, pastors sort of declining place in the community from being a credible voice or a trustworthy voice, or a person that maybe a community or a city would say, oh, this is a good person, a good citizen, someone to emulate. I mean, those tides have been turning for a long while. And I think the pandemic has maybe just sort of accelerated some of that. But there's another way in which the pandemic has been kind of the revealer of the state of our own souls, maybe because we're at home more, or certain things have forced us to kind of slow down or shut down. It's revealed the state of our own souls, to say, actually, there's a weariness deep in our souls. And sometimes when you're in the rush of ministry, the adrenaline surge just kind of carries you from one conference to one men's night out, or one women, and you're moving. And the pandemic shut down a lot of our busyness or activity. And when you stop, that's when the adrenaline kind of washes from your system, and you say, hang on a minute, I'm not actually doing well. And so in some ways, the pandemic has been a revealer of the condition of our own souls. But if we're honest, it's also been a revealer of the condition of our congregations. I mean, David, you mentioned that of people not coming back to church, or where this sort of where the gathering even factors into people's value system. So yeah, it is sad. It's a revealer. But I also think there's a little bit of, you mentioned the stat that we're tracking data only the last couple of years. But I think if we zoom back further out, and what about church history? Like, you're talking about your parents, David in ministry, Carey, your time, senior pastor stuff. I mean, but what if we zoom all the way out and look at the different eras of church history? I was talking to a seminary professor who teaches church history, and he's like, man, our fight over masks seems a little bit small when you think about the Catholic Protestant wars in the UK, and of course, none of this is to minimize or trivialize what we're experiencing, but it is only to say that if we could put this in perspective, not only historically, but think about the global church. I grew up in Malaysia. My dad pastored, my parents pastored in Malaysia for many years, a small church there. And I think about when we set our current context in the wider lens of the historic church or the global church, maybe there's a little bit of encouragement there, not to minimize or trivialize what we're going through, but to say, hey, listen, if Jesus Christ has been the head of his church through these other eras and in these other places of opposition and persecution, then the Lord is with us now, and the Lord is the one that will help us in these difficult days that we're facing here in America?
What, we touched, the data touched on friendships.
Mm.
Would love your take on that. Is it hard for pastors? Apparently it is to make close friends, right? And keep close friends. Talk about that a little bit, as well as the consequences of isolation. Because I had a round about 15 years ago where I had a few friendships dissolve. We didn't even have a pandemic, and they just kind of fell apart. And I remember I went through a year where I just said, that's it. I'm not doing friends anymore. And then after about a year, God's like, well, that's stupid. Okay, what are you going to do? And it can be really hard when you've been burned. You can just say, I'm not doing this with people, and you can close your heart. So obviously I chose a different path than that, but it took me a while. What are the consequences of isolation, and what is this deal with friendship?
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to it earlier, Carey, when you talked about the power differential stuff. I mean, one of the factors that makes relationships difficult for any leader, but particularly pastors, because the nature of our work is relational work. So unlike, a CEO of an organization, you don't need to develop the sort of relational or emotional side of your interaction with your colleagues. Although arguably, business professionals will say, well, that helps corporate culture, blah, blah, blah. But for pastors, the nature of our work is relational. So we're in all of these relational spaces, but actually there's an asymmetrical dynamic to our relationship. When I say asymmetrical, again, those watching, you can see my hand motion here, but where there's a power differential, we're always on the upside of a power differential. So one of the things pastors always talk about, and we've experienced in our own lives, is we end up being the initiators of a lot of get-togethers. We end up being the conveners of a gathering, or if someone asked us the other day, do you guys get overwhelmed by all the invitations to other people's homes? And I say, honestly, what's sad is actually people start assuming that you're too busy. So there's lots of people who don't have an asymmetrical dynamic to their relationships or their friendships. They're getting together, but you're kind of on the outside of it. Or if you do show up, it changes the dynamic. So that's challenge number one. But challenge number two is this sort of illusion of intimacy. Because our work is relational work, you kind of have this appearance or this feeling of intimacy in your interactions with people, but it's not actually substantive. Some decades ago, a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild wrote about, she called it surface acting or deep acting. And she said, surface acting is where you change the display. Someone comes up to you, they're smiling, you smile back at them. Deep acting is more like empathy, where you don't just change the display, you change what you're feeling to match the moment or match the context. You go to a funeral, you're trying to feel the sadness of that moment. You go to a wedding, you're trying to feel the joy of that moment. And she did this study on flight attendants and the toll that it takes on flight attendants to always have to be happy under stress, to always have to be cheerful under extremely sort of anxious situations. And it actually fatigues. If you think of this emotion as like a muscle, it kind of fatigues that muscle. And I think what happens to us as pastors is we're in these spaces where there's an illusion of intimacy, so people feel closer to us than we do to them. They kind of think, yeah, you're my friend, and we're saying, no, I am your friend, but I'm also your pastor. And then the other downside of that is our own emotional muscles are fatigued. So I get to a weekend and I'm thinking I probably should make time to be with friends, to be in more mutual relationships. But that muscle is fatigued from the hopefully not just surface acting, but deep acting, from actually trying to kind of move toward intimacy with people. So that's a challenge.
That's a new category for me. I think you need to play back the last 5 minutes of this interview and listen. I need to listen to that 3 or 4 times. I've never thought about that deep acting versus surface acting, or whatever you called it. That really resonates. Social media, can that be an issue? I mean, there have been times where, I don't have a huge amount of followers. I don't know. Some listeners will have far more than I do, but you're in that public role. You're on the screen every weekend. Your life is an open book on social media. And I've had people who are like, oh, it looks like you had a great party at your place Friday night. And I'm like, I don't even know your name. Like, I don't know who you are. And you realize that creates, I don't know whether you'd call that asymmetrical, another great insight, Glenn, but like this really weird thing where I know nothing about you, but you know an awful lot about me. Does that play into this at all?
Oh, that's absolutely it, Carey. I mean, those are great examples. That's definitely asymmetrical and the illusion of intimacy. I mean, both those things are
Right.
there because, again, they have a kind of digital proximity to you and your life, but you don't, it's not reciprocal. You don't have the same sort of proximity to their lives. So, another way to think of asymmetrical relationships is that they're non-mutual. They're not sort of the they're not the one another kind of stuff that the New Testament describes. And I think the other trap for leaders is it's the myth of the North Star, where you think, I just need one relationship. I just need this one kind of perfect mentor or best friend. And oftentimes for pastors, that ends up being maybe your executive pastor or the person you're most in the yoke with, so to speak. And then when those relationships get strained, then you feel the kind of pull of that. And I want to suggest, and actually lots of people have made this argument long before me. Bobby Clinton's book on years ago talked about this, a constellation method versus a North Star myth. So the myth of the North Star is I just need one relationship that will keep me anchored. Actually, in a storm, every sailor knows you don't just need a North Star, you need the constellations. And for pastors, as we're trying to navigate uncharted waters, just to push that metaphor a bit more, to navigate uncharted waters, we need a constellation of relationships. And I can't help but wonder if even Paul had to learn this the hard way. Early on, he's got Barnabas, then they get in this kind of riff about John Mark, and Paul's like, fine, I'll take Silas, But later on in his ministry, you read his letters. Every letter is it's crammed full of names, co-laborers and peers and colleagues and mentors and all this stuff. And maybe what Paul learned the hard way was, look, in ministry, you don't just need one faithful partner, you need a constellation of co-laborers. And that's what we need as pastors.
I think one of the great things about the chance of working with Glenn and for us at Barna, we're releasing this book called The Resilient Pastor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But one of the really strong points of the book, I think, is you're writing around the relational network of the early church. And I've been thinking about that a lot, really sparked by that section of your book, and thinking about what role Barna plays, what role we need to play in catalyzing a new and different approach to relationships. One of the leaders that I was personally pastored by for many years was Britt Merrick of Reality Church in Southern California here in Carpinteria. And one of his phrases was ministry proceeds through intimate relationships with Jesus, but also with intimate relationships with co-laborers. I'd love to hear you riff about that, how you kind of came to understand that and that section of the book that you wrote about, but also sort of like what that might look like, both on an individual level, because each listener, has that sort of set of questions about what do I do now with my individual relationships, but also what that might look like on a city or a national level, like the intimacy of relationships, like this apostolic moment that we have.
Well, I think that's such a wonderful phrase from Britt, and that's definitely true. And intimacy requires intentionality. Let's say it that way. Intimacy requires intentionality in all of our relationships with the Lord, with your spouse, if you're married, and certainly with friends. And I'll say, just biographically, it was 7 or 8 years ago or so, I was sitting in a conference actually at Pete Scazzero's church in Queens. And my friend Rich Velotis had invited me to this emotionally healthy kind of thing. And we're doing this, Scazzero has this tool about the rule of life. And you're supposed to write down your rhythms and habits and practices for these 4 different categories: your work life, your rest, your prayer life, and your relationships. And I got through the first 3 boxes, no problem. I know what my rhythms of work are. Even rest, I'm doing okay. Prayer, not bad. I got to the box about relationships and I realized I got nothing in here. And I had to stop and kind of reflect on that, you guys, because subconsciously, kind of unbeknownst to me, I had believed this sort of voice in my head that said, you don't have the luxury of making time for friends. You're supposed to make time for all the people you're ministering to. And I think that's a lie that a lot of pastors believe, is that to be, to lay your life down, to be poured out like a drink offering, all those phrases, that we kind of are moved by and compelled by as pastors, we think that means I don't need to be intentional about my friendships, and that's a mistake. And so one of the things that's helped me, and this is a little bit corny, you guys, but for any nerd Lord of the Rings kind of fan out there, imagine if you're Frodo, you need the same relationships that Frodo had in his life. Okay, so just humor me for 60 seconds. You need a sage, you need a Gandalf who'll pop in and out of your life. That sage is not a walk with you every day kind of person, but they're there for the key moments. They're the phone call you can make. You need a sage. But secondly, you kind of need a king. You need an Aragorn, someone who can say, we're not going to that battle, we're going to this, front of the war, and that sort of thing. And for many pastors, we don't have an authority. Even our elderships they're not people who can say no. I have people in my life that can say, no, you shouldn't say yes to this many travel commitments, because that's going to strain your other commitments and that sort of thing. So someone who can tell you no, a sage, a king. And then you need some peers. You need some people who are they're in the war, but maybe not in the same fight. So I think of this as like the dwarves or whatever, people, they're not with Frodo all the time, but peers would be like pastors. So pastors need other pastors to say, and even the work you're doing, David, with Barna, some of that, the statistics are ways of pastors saying, oh, I guess I'm not the only one. Other people are experiencing this too. So you need the report from your peers on other fronts of the battle, so to speak. And then you need some actual friends, like closer than a brother, closer than a sister kind of friends. That's the Samwise, the person who says, look, I can't carry the weight you're carrying, but I'll carry you, if needs be. I'm going to show up with a coffee at your house. I'm going to go for a walk with you. I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to judge you when you're venting at your weakest moments, all of that. And then finally, we need a healer. There's a moment there, Frodo gets, stabbed with the sword, and I think it's Arwen. It's been a while since I've seen the movies, but someone who administers healing to us. And again, pastors are often on the other side of a healing relationship. We're ministering to others, but I need a spiritual director. That's been the lifeline for me over the last several years, is seeing a spiritual director or seeing a counselor. Those are places where we can receive healing ourselves. So if it's helpful to think through those categories of relationships and then to be intentional about it and to say, who are those people in my life?
And now you have another reason to watch Lord of the Rings, with some nerd peers. So there you go. Nerd culture. You didn't expect it, or maybe you did from the Barna ChurchPulse Weekly. But for those nerds out there, it's like they were lapping that up. It's good stuff, though. Truly, Glenn. I was making notes myself about thinking in the background about the people in my life that serve those different roles. So you need a sage, a king, peers, friends, and healers.
How did you go personally from that moment with Pete Scazzaro, where you had nothing for the fourth box of friends, to the point where you started to populate? Because I resonate with when we started ministry here, we got so many invitations, we didn't have time hardly to sleep. And so then eventually I learned the discipline of saying no. And then eventually they stopped coming. And our church reached a certain size where people just assumed he's too busy. And to some extent it was true, but then I realized, we need to now intentionally go out, flip the switch, and start making and building friendships and relationships. So how did you do that when you went from a deficit to where you are now? What are some of the practical tips?
I started texting my friends right then and there from the auditorium there and saying, hey guys, what if we, once a month got together for breakfast and we just shared with each other what we're reading, idea exchange. And instantly people were texting back, I'm in. You name the day and the time. Like they were hungry for it too. And then we did like a month. I built in a monthly thing. We built in a quarterly thing, or almost like 3 times a year really would be more accurate. Where, once in the spring, once in the fall, once in the summer, where we take a day and we would take a work day. A lot of us work at the same church, but we don't oversee each other. So there wasn't the power differential things. We're all leading different congregations at New Life. And many of us have been friends for 20 years. So I recognize that I have a luxury in my position here, and not every pastor has that same setup, but whoever it is, you can set up these kind of monthly or quarterly or annual kind of things. When I did focus groups for this book, so, Barna did a bunch of data and surveys and research that went out. And then I wanted to pair that with some sort of, some qualitative work. So I invited pastors to join my focus group, and I had people from the US, Canada, and the UK. And most of them said, look, I do actually have a handful of friends. And some of them named pastors in their city. Some of them named pastors they were in seminary with. And so I have a monthly group that I'm on a Zoom call with. They're pastors from all around the country, three others, so four of us all together. And we chat every month on Zoom. So there's ways of thinking through this, like, how do I actually build this in? And for me, if it's not in the calendar, Carey, then it doesn't exist and it's not going to happen,
I agree. Well, I got to tell you, I am very excited about The Resilient Pastor. And literally, I just got it in my hand within the last 24 hours. So I haven't had a chance to do a deep dive. However, I'm looking at the table of contents. I'm excited. 4 challenges for pastors: vocation, spirituality, relationships, credibility. Then challenges for the church. You've got spiritual formation. Rich Velotis has a few things to say about that. Worship. And then hope for tomorrow. So you kind of break apart the individual, but then also the challenges with the church. And I think in light of the stats and how we're all kind of feeling, this is just-in-time help, The Resilient Pastor. What are some of the key characteristics of resilience, Glenn?
When you go in for a stress test or a health check with the doctor, one of the things they'll do, as we're getting older and all this stuff, is they'll deliberately put your body under stress to see how well you can recover from it. And the idea is health doesn't mean you never get sick. Health is about how quickly you bounce back. And I think there's something to that even for pastors. It doesn't mean we'll never feel anxious or we'll never feel depressed or we'll never feel down. It doesn't mean that we won't experience that. But part of health is, how do we find our way back? How do we recalibrate after experiencing disruption or disorientation? And this is not to say that there's a timetable to this, because everybody's experiencing different levels of disruption or disorientation, right? I mean, grief is a particular kind of disorientation that you never recover from. So please hear me. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you bounce back to normal or that sort of thing, but only to say that resilience is a kind of health check for us as pastors. Not that we never experience storms or turbulence, but that we are somehow able to kind of recalibrate. But I think as Christians, we would say resilience is not something we just sort of will ourselves into and kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. The last thing I want listeners to hear or readers from the book to take away is that, this is another to-do for pastors. This is another, I got to be resilient.
Oh, great. Now I feel worse about myself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not it at all. And so early on in the book, I think the first step toward resilience is renewing our first love. I think very often about that encounter that Jesus had with Peter in John 21, where Peter's experienced this profound disruption and disorientation of the crucifixion and his own failure, so much so that even after the resurrection, he's not really sure what his purpose is supposed to be. He thought about quitting full-time ministry, maybe, going back to fishing. But Jesus says to him, not, Peter, do you love the church? Not, Peter, do you love my teachings? Not, Peter, do you love signs and wonders? Not, Peter, do you want a move of God? I mean, he doesn't ask Peter any of those things, even though Peter will preach and Peter will see miracles happen and Peter will see the church grow. What he says to Peter in that moment is, Peter, do you love me? And I think for all of us as pastors, for me personally, what renews us, the beginning, the sort of catalyst for resilience is the renewal of our first love. The other gospels record Peter's first call. Jesus says, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And I wonder in my mind, if Peter's initial following of Jesus was about a purpose. Yes, Lord, I'm signing up for the cause. We'll be fishers of men, And so many of us sign up to plant churches and lead churches because we believe in the cause. But the thing that sustains us over the long haul is not our love of a purpose, but our love of a person. And that's what Jesus does for Peter, is he says, do you love me? So I think resilience begins with renewing our first love. I think resilience is reinforced by the right relationships around you. We've talked about that. But finally, I think resilience is anchored by the hope of resurrection. Resurrection reminds us that even if the worst thing happens, if the church folds, if, whatever, even if the worst thing happens, God is the God who raises the dead. There's something beyond this story. There's something even beyond this time on earth that awaits us. And I think very often about 1 Corinthians 15, you guys, where Paul goes on and on about the resurrection. If Jesus hasn't been raised from the dead, then we of all people are to be pitied, and all of this stuff. And then at the very end of it, he says, therefore be steadfast, immovable, always kind of, devoting yourself to this, be excellent in God's work, knowing that your labor will not be in vain. And at the end of the day, for all of us as pastors, we don't know if numbers are going to get back. We don't know what a new normal is. We don't know any of that. But we do know that if we trust the God who raises the dead, our labor will not be in vain. And that's why we get out of bed every morning, is to say, Lord, because Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, let my labor not be in vain today.
Well, I'd love to jump in on that. Thank you, Glenn. That's such a beautiful reflection. What was the verse that you are referencing there?
1 Corinthians 15. Let me get the exact verse for you. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think a little bit of backstory to Barna's partnership with Glenn might be helpful to listeners. And we're launching this book with Glenn, along with Baker Books, The Resilient Pastor. We're also working across a wide range of ways that Barna can show up in 2022 to support pastors. It's a major initiative. I've felt like I've heard from the Lord myself as the leader of Barna that we're meant to be especially helpful in this time of for pastors, not the least of which, and Glenn mentioned this earlier, is to give voice to pastors through the data. You're not crazy. You're not alone. And so the book is really part of a larger effort that, again, only the Lord could have orchestrated, because we started talking about this book before the pandemic. And then, and so, we started, we've been praying about someone to write a book on pastors, today's pastors, issues facing leaders. And of course, books are very challenging propositions to complete. Glenn did a masterful job of both helping come alongside our research team to orient and direct some of the study, the quantitative study. As he mentioned, he did a lot of qualitative work as well. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. Glenn was working on the manuscript. All the things came together. And then, as we've been tracking pastors in 2021, the recognition, as we talked about at the start of this podcast, that there was a growing crisis for leaders. Sort of the long shadow of this pandemic has made it even harder to be resilient, and it's revealing all those places where we're weak as leaders, weaker than we intended to be, and weaker than we need to be. And so, Glenn's been such a great partner, not just in the writing of the book, but as we seek the Lord as a company, as a group of people, to try to serve leaders, to encourage men and women who are leading in today's churches, to inspire a new generation of leaders to come to the forefront, to help blow off the dust, and to help sort of maybe unleash even some new wineskin thinking about what God calls leaders to do in this moment. So we're so pleased with the opportunity to work with Glenn. The book itself is a really, as you said, Carey, I have had the chance to read it, and as you said, it's actually a really eloquent look at 4 challenges facing leaders, but also 4 challenges facing the church, and how do we stay resilient? How do we lean in on resilience in this particular time? And so, we just encourage pastors and listeners, if you serve pastors, or it's a book for and about pastors, but it's also a book about all of us in Christian ministry and those that are sort of influenced by and affected by pastoral ministry. Because I think we're in this really important moment that none of us predicted, but we all find ourselves in that so many of the things we thought were working just aren't working. And I think God is doing a new thing. Isaiah 43:19, and behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? And I think we're just, here on this podcast, hoping to dig deeper. Maybe some of this sort of deep acting, where we're not just sort of smiling back at God because he smiles on us, but we're in fact trying to find our truest center in a time of great change. And, for me, I'm actually, it's funny because as a social researcher, we do our best work sometimes looking in the rear view mirror, because it's a lot easier to ask social research about what people thought, what they did, what they have done, and much less easy. Sometimes people will say, well, you're a futurist. I'm really not a futurist. I'm really just, I've got a great rear view mirror. But I do think that God, for me personally, for our company, in working with Glenn, this Resilient Pastor initiative, the Resilient Pastor book, we really are trying to, look, sort of turn the headlights up a bit and say, God, where are you taking the church? Where could we go? And not in some false way of just like predicting a few little futurist trends, but just really trying to say, God, how are you orienting us as leaders to be better connected, to be equipped for ministry and all the good things that you give us, Lord, and then recognizing that we're going to have to be stronger to meet some of the challenges that are coming, more resilient in order to meet the challenges that I think the church is facing in the future. So just a little bit of context for our partnership with Glenn, and as a senior fellow of Barna, kind of his role in trying to help as a voice of pastors, for pastors, to pastors, helping to navigate some of those changes. But man, we're here for you as leaders. We want to help equip you and encourage you. You're not crazy. You're not alone. And God has, I think, even more for us in store than we could imagine.
And David, I think Barna is uniquely positioned to serve pastors in this way, because like Carey said, you're not guessing at stuff. You've got data, and you've got a network that can help pastors find one another, so I think it's wonderful.
Well, that's an exciting announcement, Glenn. I'm very, very excited to dive into the book, and your scholarly background is showing, and I think it's really helpful to have what I would call substantive analysis, not just, here's a nice little devotion that'll get you through the next 10 minutes. Not that that's not valuable, but I really think we need something deeper. And I want to see the best and the brightest move into ministry, and I want to see the best and the brightest stay engaged in the church. And I think partnerships like this between you, Glenn, and Barna, and books like this are really going to help. It's called The Resilient Pastor. It is leading your church in a rapidly changing world. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today. David, as always, what a joy to be able to do this with you. Got a lot of questions left, so maybe we'll have to do another round later this year. So that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And we are in your corner. And if you haven't left a rating or review on Church Pulse Weekly, please do so wherever you listen. We'll be back next time with a fresh episode.